The other topic that comes up all the time is why don't individuals leave? If the abuser is the connect, I want you to try to say the most intimate things you have ever done with a partner. Sometimes y'all treat women like, let me bring it to you on a personal level. Have y'all ever spin the block? Because the behavior of the predator or the abuser actually does cost not only the individual, but society as a whole. That the same type of predators that exist for Black women in the community are also victimizing Black men. And that's important for all victims to know. It is not your fault, nor your responsibility to heal your abuser. Well, the younger the victim, the less likely they have that advanced cognitive developmental skills. There's still a hesitation that exists that is historic that denies Black women, especially, the benefit of the doubt. Y'all, there was so much to cover. I didn't even get to talk about the effect of trauma on someone's memory recall. But if you want to understand survivors, this is the video for you. So, you guys, there has been lots of conversation about this new celebrity case. And while I do not want to focus so much on the celebrities themselves, I do think the case has brought up quite a number of questions. And to my dismay, because I will say that over the last several years, especially with the Me Too movement, I thought that we got a little bit further when it came to um, survivors and how survivors think and the dynamics of these relationships. But unfortunately, here we are, and there's still apparently lots for us to learn. So I am Dr. T on this platform. I am known as Dr. T. In my day-to-day life, I'm an OBGYN and have been in the field for over 20 years. But before I became an obstetrician gynecologist, I spent time as a grape crisis counselor. So what is a grape crisis counselor? And I'm using the letter G for algorithmic reasons. I've spent some time as a grape crisis counselor. Some states, some communities may have it. And matter of fact, with the improvement in the training of the emergency room staff, there's been less emphasis on getting great crisis counselors in the ER, though I still think that there is a benefit to having this particular role in advocacy. So, as a great crisis counselor, I would be on call. And when a survivor would come into the emergency room, we would be called in to assist that survivor in the process of whatever they decided to do, which can include a grape kit collection or examination, STI counseling and treatment, and so forth. So, who tended to be great crisis counselor? Well, at the time, I was in my training to become a physician. So, from my personal experience, it was exclusively women and women of various backgrounds, ethnicities, race, socioeconomic status, just all with a common goal of helping survivors get through these experiences. So we would basically go into the emergency room, and our goal was to be the advocate of the survivor. And so my particular role as a great crisis counselor was to assist the individual in their process, was to advocate for them. If they didn't want a certain procedure done, if I saw that they were becoming overwhelmed, I would intervene and ask for a moment on their behalf. I would ask them and verify with them if they were certain as to what they wanted to be done. And our goal was to educate. So we would educate survivors on their rights, on the hospital policies, on things they can do during the evaluation, sort of walk them through what the process would be like before anyone entered the room. And thankfully, the emergency rooms that we worked with were very familiar with the work that we did. And so they were very welcoming for us to have that type of authority to be able to take a pause, walk with the survivor, speak with the survivor before any medical professional, including nursing, would enter the room. We would also counsel survivors on what they can do afterwards and what that process was like of following up the great kits. We would also be in the room with them when they were being questioned by law enforcement. So it's a very, as you can imagine, was a very involved, very intense experience. And I will say, even to this day, I continue to have very vivid memories of cases that were over 20 years ago. That experience was probably the most intense experience outside of being on the clinician side. On the clinician side, over many years, I have encountered, unfortunately, many victims. And this is not unusual, right? As we all know, specifically, I'm going to be focused on IPV, which is Intimate Partner V. VIOLENCE. I will be referring to it as just IPV for algorithmic reasons. Let me know in the comments, what are signs that you know that someone may be in an IPV relationship? Either from things that you've witnessed, things that you've heard, things that you just deduced would be a potential sign that someone would be in an IBV relationship. I want you to hit me up below. Let me know what you think. I'm gonna let you know at the end of this video whether or not you're right. And so I have been in these internet streets. I've been reading your comments, learning how you think and what you think, so that I can address some of these questions that you may have. So why am I addressing these questions? Well, while you've had exposure to a lot of the legal opinion regarding this particular case, there is an aspect of it which is from the medical perspective. And I'm not going to tap into as much or dive into the psychological aspect of it. That is not my lane. So I'm going to stay in my lane of women's health. And through my experience of helping survivors, my goal is to really enlighten you and to encourage survivors not to be discouraged by some of the comments they may see. And unfortunately, some of the comments are very typical questions and commentary that people have. And a lot of the stereotypes about survivors in these relationships still persist. So IPV is a type of VIOLENCE. However, it brings very unique dynamics. And because of the intimate relationship, and the dynamics of those intimate relationship, it oftentimes confuses the outsider as to the decision making of the survivor. So let's talk about IPV. And before I continue, if you are watching us for the very first time, first of all, welcome to the club. Help us to get to 10,000 subscribers. That is our goal. If you feel the information you're hearing this platform is valid and is valuable for any reason, if not yourself, for someone else, go ahead, please support us by clicking the like button and the subscribe button. Thank you for joining the village, and let's keep going. Okay, so let's talk about IPV. As I said, IPV is unfortunately common, and it is common across genders, ethnicity, races. There is no ethnic group or demographic group that is protected or isolated from these types of incidences. How common is it? I'm going to give you the latest stats, which is from the CDC, and this data is from 2022. About 41% of women and 26% of men will experience some type of IPV, which can include intimate, the VIOLENCE, or physical V, or stalking by an intimate partner at some point during their lifetime, and reported the impact. So again, high numbers, 41% of women is a lot of women. And even the 26% of men is a lot of men. If you think about the population in the US, which is now, I believe, 340 million. So break that down by adults and break that down even further, and you will see we're talking about millions of individuals. Over 61 million women and 53 million men have experienced psychological aggression by an intimate partner in their lifetime. What's very important to know, and perhaps this particular part will bring some context, is that IPV tends to start early. So for individuals who experience IPV, when they were questioned about the onset, about 60% of women and 11% of men reported experiencing intimate partner V in their lifetime, said that the first experience happened before the age of 18. So predators will oftentimes target the young. So what's important to know about why is that important to begin with? Well, the younger the victim, the less likely they have that advanced cognitive developmental skills, right? So this is the age group that's just really starting to learn how to reason and how to make good judgment calls. So their ability to um, assess their situation and to reason through their situation is limited. So if you're going through a cognitive development stage, that can extend as old as 18 years old. And they're saying that millions of individuals have had some initial encounter in that same time frame before they're 18 years old, then you can understand better how they tend to be easier to be groomed. And when you're in your 20s and your early 20s, you're not far from this stage. You're still really working on your developmental skills in terms of reasoning and logical thinking. So it makes this particular group very vulnerable to these types of to these types of experiences. So I mentioned a word that's thrown around a lot, grooming, right? What is grooming? Grooming is the act of really selecting where a predator selects their potential victim and prepares the victim for the abuse that's going to happen. And so those individuals who are more likely to be groomed, again, as mentioned, are the younger, the youth, the teenagers, the adolescent, the early adulthood years. Those are the easier years for individuals to be groomed or for this grooming process to start. As mentioned, predators oftentimes will study their victims because they are really good at detecting certain behavioral patterns. And so they're more likely to identify people who are easy targets. And an easy target is someone that you can isolate better because the more isolated the individual and the more willing the individual to give up their relationships that are protective relationships, the more the predator is able to draw a wedge between the relationship that is a protective relationship, whether it's a best friend, a sibling, a father or a mother, the easier that target becomes. And if they can get their potential victim to start talking negatively about that person who is their protector, then they are primed for grooming. They will also normalize abnormal behavior. So they will start to break down the barriers and break down barriers that that individual would oftentimes naturally have. So for example, touch. So gradually they will start to touch and violate the barriers little by little. Predators will gradually weaken the individual's boundaries. They will start to make those boundaries more gray. And one thing I do want to make mention, one thing that makes one thing that makes boundaries more gray is when there is a transition of relationships. I'll put my glasses up for this part because I gotta make sure y'all see me well when I talk to y'all about this part. So when you have the transition of relationships, for example, when someone is converted from being an employee to one of um, an intimate relationship, or vice versa, they are pursuing them in terms of a potential intimate relationship, but all under the guise of a potential partner, and then they convert them into an employee, it creates the dynamic that then set up the playing field for power. Because power then can be used as a tool of manipulation. You got me? So the boundaries are likely to get a little bit more gray and allow individuals to assert their power over the next individual. So, what does this look like? One of the things that predators will do is I've noticed that they will also build trust. And so there will be a time in which they start to create secrets or make the individual feel that they are the only person that they are disclosing or being transparent to. So it makes the potential victim feel like they are special in some way or that they have a special relationship. But the key is the way you tell the difference is that there is a demand or a requirement of secrecy, right? So it can also be demonstrated by gift giving. So they will start to give gifts, subtle gifts, but then those gifts have to be a secret. So you're kind of my girlfriend, but I don't want anyone to know quite yet. You're my little secret, but we have something special between us, right? Right. Building that trust. These are ways that a predator will start to groom a potential victim. And so one of the purpose of today's talk is really to empower anyone that's looking at this video to, if they are a potential victim, to at least have some basic information on things that they can do. And a reminder to any survivor who is looking at this video who's not completely out of their situation. And a reminder to any potential victims who is watching this video, please remember to clear your browser. Very, very important. You can watch videos, but make sure you clear your browser after you've obtained the information that you need. Got it? Capiche? All right, that's a survivor tip. So the other thing that I wanted to discuss is, first of all, empathy, right? So with a lot of these really publicized famous cases, there's still a lot of victim blaming, and I'm going to talk about that in a little bit. There's also a lot of exposure for the victim. Now, mind you, the survivor is not the abuser, right? And for those who have wondered about the risk of false claims and what's the likelihood of false claims, and I understand that this is a particular question for my Black men because they have a history of experiencing false claims when it comes to cases where there's racial, if you know what I mean, read between the lines. And so historically, there is a suspicion always when it comes to Black men, but I will definitely tell y'all that Black men are predators too. Every single race, ethnicity, unfortunately have predators, and when there are predators, there are victims. But we're going to talk about the Black dynamic in a little bit because that's a very unique dynamic. But people always wonder why the hesitancy of people speaking up. And the hesitancy of people speaking up has to do with the fact that they're oftentimes re-victimized on the witness stand or when they're going through the process of making a claim. So you will have a lot of victims that feel like they were being shamed by law enforcement or felt uncomfortable sharing their stories or their experiences, which is why great crisis counselors existed. You will also hear those who felt that they were shamed or there was bias language used in the medical profession. And then also in the legal system, they feel re-victimized. One of the ways in which survivors feel re-victimized is one that unfortunately a lot of states, when you look at the stats, there's a huge backlog of great kits. And so it's hard for survivors to get great kits done. And then it almost feels like a slap in the face when the states don't process those same kits. And so the delay in processing increases the likelihood that someone's not going to go ahead with filing charges or reporting the crime, or even going forth with any type of suits. Now, granted, they don't make the decisions in terms of criminal cases, but they do make decisions in terms of civil cases. And granted, we will talk about whether or not y'all believe that survivors should be compensated financially. That's a whole other conversation. But we'll hopefully get there because there's a lot to talk about. So why don't um so the other thing is when they're on the stand, now I want y'all to really think about this, right? Could you imagine being on a platform where the entire world is going to know the most intimate details of your bedroom escapades? And I'm talking from the voluntary perspective, because then I want you to also contemplate it in the context of involuntary um, violations, right? Because context is going to be king. Context is always king when we our queen. When we talk about these cases, it's really important to put age groups, setting, dynamics of relationship together and to fully understand what happened. It's really important. But let's go back to what happens on the witness stand. On the witness stand, they have to tell the most intimate details. And not just, we're not talking about intimate details of a love affair. We're talking about intimate details of being violated, of acts that provoke the feeling of shame. So not only were you feeling this act of shame in privacy, but now you are feeling this act, you have to experience shame on a public level. And it doesn't matter if that public level is the world or a full courtroom of individuals. I want you to put into words. If you can say right now, I want you to try to say the most intimate things you have ever done with a partner. And some of you will experience um, a level of shyness. Some of you may even experience shame to a certain degree. So now try to put into perspective how difficult it is for survivors, all survivors, to be able to express to one, two, three, a room full of people, because that's what happens, right? They express what happened to the medical profession, usually initially, then it leads on to law enforcement. Then they may have to talk to a lawyer, their own lawyer, and then they have to talk to a courtroom. It is a very grueling process and it is emotionally trying. The other topic that comes up all the time is, why don't individuals leave? Let's get into the dynamics of IPV. IPV is not just your DV, which can be a non-intimate relationship, right? IPV brings a unique perspective because it is very possible for the victim to be in love or conflicted with infatuation or the emotion of love towards their abuser. And this is the part that confuses the public, right? Because the public perspective is, if someone ate you that or treated you abusively, that you should be ating that person. And that doesn't always exist. Let me bring it to you on a personal level. Have y'all ever spin the block? Right? So you had a bad relationship in the past, and I'm not saying an abusive relationship, I'm just saying a relationship that didn't work out. That person pops up, and you either were tempted to spin the block or you spin the block. Conflicting emotions, right? It almost doesn't make sense. You love this person, yet you didn't like the things that they did, which is why you broke up with this person or the relationship ended. Yet you're conflicted by these emotions. That's no different than the conflicting and even more so conflicting dynamics of individuals that are involved in an IPV relationship. They are sometimes still in love or infatuated or have very strong emotions of favor towards their abuser. Stockholm syndrome, which is a whole other, go to the therapist to explain that. That's out of my field. I'm not going to explain that. But I just want you to start to contemplate the fact that that is one factor, but not the only factor. So other factors that may limit someone's decision or ability to leave include the fact that, does the other partner have known allegations? Let's put it that way. If the partner or the abuser, which is why you got to be very careful about how you pick your poison. or just not pick poison, right? Because if your abuser has access to firearms or weapons, the individual is less likely to leave. If a survivor witnessed the abuser being violent, did I spell that right? To some other individual, if they witness another act of violence, hopefully they won't flag me, then the survivor is less likely to leave because they fear what they saw or what they witnessed or what they heard. So if the abuser has a history of either witnessed or alleged extreme crimes or acts of violence, then the survivor is less likely to leave. Another dynamic that's difficult is a survivor who has a low self-esteem or unaliving behavior. That is someone that has reached a level of hopelessness that doesn't believe that they can either survive outside of the relationship or that they can truly exit the relationship. So that's another factor to be taken into consideration. Technology has also brought in another factor into these dynamics because if individuals feel there may be some type of retaliation that may be with the use of technology, and if the abuser has power financially and influential power, then survivors are less likely to leave because they fear the use of technology or exposure as a potential threat to their future. And so they oftentimes feel trapped if there is evidence of their abuse, whether they're evidence of their physical abuse or evidence of their intimate abuse, right? Then you have those who have childhood experiences that are cycling through the choices that they make on an intimate level. And that history of childhood adverse events also factors into their decision making with their abuser. And it doesn't necessarily have to be a childhood experience that directly impacted them, but if they witnessed abuse of a parent, for example, or abuse of a loved one like a sibling, then that sometimes will make their decision making more compromised. Then you have the impact of addiction. So, not only, as you guys know, how well the people that you have known, been exposed to, are directly or indirectly, how well do they make decisions when they're under the influence or when they have an addiction, a chemical addiction? And many of you will say the individuals that you have heard of, seen, witnessed indirectly or indirectly do not make great decisions when they're under the influence. However, when it's proven or heard that the survivor has some type of addiction behavior, it oftentimes results in two destructive responses. One, which says that I lack empathy because you already made a bad decision to become an addict. The second response is, even though I know that you're an addict and that you're chemically altered and your decision making and judgment is impaired by your addiction, I somehow still hold you to the expectation of making good judgment decisions. The other factor when it comes to addiction that we have to keep in mind is the fact that if the abuser is the connect in which the survivor who is addicted to, chemically addicted, receives their supply, then it also introduces a factor in which they are less likely to leave the situation because now they have a need that they cannot break, or they have to get to the point where they are ready in the mindset to break the addiction in order to get out. But if they're constantly being fed to keep them addicted, they are less likely to desire to get out of that situation because they're constantly having to deal with the addiction. They're not in a setting in which they have people who will protect them, who will encourage them to break their addiction. They're in a setting in which someone is using their addiction to further their abusive behavior towards them. Does that make sense? And especially if someone has the power, allegedly, to block the ability of the survivor from getting a supply outside of them, because that's part of how they control the survivor, then it's even more unlikely that that survivor is going to leave. Y'all, these things are complicated. So here are some other examples as to why people don't leave. One, if they are dependent on their abuser for essentials of daily living, so for eating or for required medication, um, we're not talking about recreational pills, then they're less likely to leave. If they believe that the abuse is the price to be paid to survive, again, this has to do with prior either trauma or historical psychological issues that made them believe that somehow they deserve the abuse, then they're less likely to leave. If they feel that they will not be believed, need I say more? If they feel that the power of the person has either so much influence and power that they won't be believed, or they believe that because of who they are and who they represent. So, for example, this speaks to individuals who are like in the sex industry, right? Because a lot of people presume, and I'm going to touch on that too, that because someone's in the sex industry, that it's par for the course. That's what you get. So, if an individual, for a variety of reasons, doesn't believe that they would be believed, they're less likely to disclose or to leave. If they have already been socially isolated, if they have if they have been blocked from advancing themselves economically or educationally, then they're less likely to leave. If they have some type of fear of reporting, so if there's allegedly their abuser has some type of relationship or pre-existing relationship with law enforcement, such as retired, allegedly, law enforcement working for them, then the abuser is then the survivor is less likely to leave or to report that a crime has happened. Um, and then it becomes and then you have those who are physically prevented from leaving. So those who are otherwise abled, who may not have access to like a wheelchair intentionally. Those who are physically barred in are tied up or physically restricted from leaving, they are less likely to leave for the obvious reasons. Sometimes you have other relationships that are used as leverage. So, for example, if someone's in a relationship where their abuser is helping another family member, like a parent that is in need and that survivor doesn't have the means to keep that family member financially supported, then abusers sometimes will use that leverage. Or for a woman who has concerns about losing custody of her child, if she reports that the incident occurred, you better believe that they're less likely to leave. I've also witnessed um, women who decide not to leave because they're so financially bound to their abuser, which could be, again, we're speaking specifically of intimate partner V, um, that they don't have the ability to protect their children. And so they will oftentimes stay in those situations for the sake of the kids because they can't see an option in which they can survive or provide for the children otherwise. And they don't want to fathom the idea of leaving the kids with the abuser. Okay. So, and then you get to the point where this just become their norm. There is a certain point where this type of relationship becomes so much habit or habitual that it actually recreates a new norm for the survivor and the abuser. And the abuse can come in various forms. And I haven't really gone into that, but it's going to include isolation, emotional, economic, sexual, use of children, privilege of being a guy, intimidation, especially if the abuser is of a certain body type, and or the survivor is of a certain body type. Then you have the cycle of abuse, right? And this is the part that also confuses people, right? Like the person just did XYZ to you. Why not leave at this particular point? There's two things that have come up when I read all your comments, right? Two questions that has come up. So people have made a false equivalency. When you see someone leave an incident, it is not the same as the individual leaving the relationship. So sometimes you will have victims who will muster up the courage or who will get so frustrated and so fed up that they, in that moment, muster up the courage to leave an incident, but they don't yet have the courage to leave the relationship because of all the factors I just shared, right? And so they will retrieve to a place of temporary safety, and then they will start to process all the factors, all the pluses, all the minuses, and they would decide to, and they would oftentimes not make a definitive decision to leave. And in that moment, the abuser is also going through their cycle and they have realized what they have done, especially if there's a unexpected response to the act, the V act, the VIOLENT act, that they will then go into the honeymoon phase, right? This is where the gift giving happens. This is where the smooth talking happens. This is where the newer generation called the love bombing happens, right? They will pop those love bombs 24/7. You are the world. You are the gift of my life. You are my everything. It's always in the excess, right? It is always above and beyond. It has this level of grandiosity to it. And so they will go through the honeymoon stage, and then little by little, and the time frame and interval in which these different stages happen can differ and can actually start to shorten as the relationship lengthens. They will then start to have increased tensioning again, right? Because the behavior patterns resume. The thing that the triggers start to happen again, right? This is the time period where the survivor senses that the tensioning is start to build again. They are remembering what happened, and so now they are walking on eggshells, and they're trying not to make a misstep to resume in the act that happened before, the traumatic experience that happened before, and they're trying to hold on to this honeymoon period, which I'm gonna tell y'all, it's never gonna last. That honeymoon period never lasts unless there's some real significant intervention that happens for the relationship as a whole. That honeymoon period will only get shorter and shorter sometimes. And when you're back in that part where they are experiencing the tension building, it's already too late because now they feel they can't leave because they can feel that things are starting to escalate and they are remembering what happened the last time. And their hope is that it doesn't get as violent the next time, but oftentimes it does, and it becomes worse and worse. The other main factor that I did not mention as to why survivors don't leave is because literally a lot of victims don't survive when they try to leave. When they try to leave, especially if it's not planned, intentionally planned down to the very utmost detail. What's really important is for us to understand that these are acts of violence. These are acts of violent behavior. The only thing the abuser knows what to do is to be abusive. And when the person or the victim tries to leave, they feel like they have lost all control and they are struggling to get control back. I'm sorry, I'm not a psychologist, so I'm not going to go down that path too much with y'all, but this is just from my experience and things that I have observed, unfortunately. So I'm just trying to give you guys some overview, but I'm not going to dig too deep in my colleague's kitchen. I'm gonna let them handle those parts. And there, guys, there are so many other factors that I'm not going into, and some of it is really in the realm of behavioral health, mental health therapists, psychologists, psychiatrists, in that home realm. And we will have them go into those details. I'm just trying to give you guys an overview and answer some of your what if, why not questions that I've seen come up on these internet streets. Okay, so why go back? And again, this is an area that probably my colleagues can deal with better, but a lot of the reasons why people go back is the same reasons why people don't leave in the first place, especially if they get to the point where they feel hopeless or they still have some um emotions of either hope or hopeless, right? So either they have hope that at one point the relationship is eventually going to change, or they're so hopeless that nothing's going to change and they can never leave and survive that they won't completely leave, they will go back. Even after, what's really interesting that you'll see from this as a classic behavior of predators is that even when there is a time of separation that they would allow, right? So some predators will allow the survivor to leave temporarily. And they create a honeymoon stage in which they start to woo that survivor back gradually. And so, again, I mentioned this is where the love bombing happens. And even if years go by, you will still see the same dynamics happen. If the underlying issues have not been fixed or addressed, and let's say that they did separate and the survivor did survive leaving the person and they had an encounter with the person years later, they still sometimes can have those very confused feelings. It's the same reason people spin the block all the time. And I'm not saying that, that I'm not trying to equate spinning the block from a failed relationship or a former relationship to spinning the block in an abusive relationship, but I'm trying to make the comparison in terms of the fact that people oftentimes have very conflicting feelings about their ex. And having that conflicting feeling is not just experienced by individuals who had healthy relationships that just didn't work out. People who have toxic, unhealthy relationships still do have very conflicting feelings towards their ex and will spin that block, even if it doesn't make sense, even if they are theoretically putting themselves at risk. A lot of times they have this hope and belief that the 5 or 6 or how many every years have passed, that predator or abuser has somehow changed. And that's again because the general public doesn't understand the patterns of abuse and the patterns of abusive relationships and those dynamics and how they work. And I don't want to make this seem like it's a attack on predators, even though I'm sure many people will co-sign just getting onto predators, because there is a certain level of victimization that happens with who becomes a predator also. And though I'm not going to go into that for this particular talk, let's just say that there are many things we can do in society that actually has been statistically shown to decrease the likelihood that someone would become a predator. So let's keep that in mind also. So basically, both people got to do the work. Let's get into a few more things and then we're going to wrap this up. So the other dynamics that we don't quite often talked about, but I talked about in a prior video, so I'm not really going to go into much on this video, is why not call the cops? Sometimes some predators have very powerful relationships, including with cops. Sometimes cops are not necessarily empathetic or have a structure that is compassionate towards survivors. And sometimes people just don't feel like they can be believed by the cops or that they will be treated well. And historically, there's certain communities in the United States of America that particularly have a very unhealthy relationship with cops to begin with. And so it's very unlikely that survivors will go to cops because of some of those historical issues. There was some conversation about, was somebody into BDSM? Maybe this is just a BDSM relationship. And here's what's really important. And if you haven't watched our conversation with someone who's in the BDSM community, make sure you go back and hit up that video because she really exposed this to what the 411 is about how that community works. And what's really interesting and important to know is that those communities are very strict with consent. Because if they weren't, could you imagine how many cases would come out of them? So the BDSM community is actually one of the most conscientious community when it comes to consent for acts of intimacy. So being in the BDSM community does not somehow or should not somehow expose you to be victimized in any way. It doesn't even matter if someone's in the X industry. They still have the right to say no, and they still have autonomy over their body. They still have autonomy. The reason they're in those industry, I'm not talking about those who again are in abusive dynamics, but those who are voluntarily in those industry are doing it autonomously. And so it does not mean that somehow they should be victimized, or if they are victimized, that we lack compassion because of their lifestyle choices. It just doesn't make sense. And then what's interesting that I've noticed with a lot of these major publicized court cases is the fact that people are still very much in tune to what someone is wearing. Our society still makes note of what people are wearing in the courtroom as a way of assessing someone's innocence or someone's guilt. And oftentimes, right now, when survivors take the stand, they are being assessed as if they are the abuser. And unfortunately, what they wear, even in the courtroom, somehow still has relevance in the reporting that's done. And what the predator or the alleged predator um, is wearing is also still taken into account. So it shows us that we have not come very far when it comes to looking at what someone is wearing. And y'all, I totally forgot to tell y'all that I actually teach on this topic too. I'm sorry. I like mentioned everything else and then forgot to tell y'all that I actually teach on this topic as I'm going through some of my lectures in my head. Um, yeah, I also teach on this topic. So here's a couple of things to keep in mind as well. Someone's attire when they are victimized or when they are fighting for justice should never matter. So if she came, we have to start to change our mindset. If a survivor walks in the courtroom with a short skirt, and I'm granted they probably won't because of the decorum of the courtroom, but it really should not matter what color they're wearing, what type of dress they're wearing, if their dress makes them look innocent or if their dress makes them look guilty, if they're trying to assert power with the type of attire that they wear, all these things shouldn't matter. And the fact that we're still having conversations about these things really tells us how far we've yet to go. I feel like I should do a part 2 on this. Um, quickly, before we're done, um, quickly, before we're done, if you are an individual, hold up. I feel like there's still so much I want to share with y'all, but I'm gonna wrap this up because I can go on for lectures. I'm not even kidding. I do lectures on this topic. Before I go, since I mentioned this earlier, let's talk about how do you know that someone may be in these type of circumstances, like what type of behavioral characteristics you should look for. And granted, I mentioned some of them already, but here's some very important ones that you should be mindful of. If someone's very hyper vigilant, right? So if someone's always looking over their shoulder, always kind of a little paranoid, always kind of tense on edge, that person, that's a red flag. If someone is always deferring to the other person to answer questions and to provide information, like where were you last weekend? And they're looking to the person to answer that question, that's a red flag. If someone is constantly, for example, covering up, even in warm weathers, they're constantly wearing long clothes, long sleeves, long pants, even in very hot weather, that's a red flag. Or if all of a sudden they're dressing a lot more provocatively and they haven't dressed like that before, that's a red flag. Now, what's interesting and very unique to Black women, and I think possibly women in general, is when you see major changes in their hair. One of the flags of change and resistance and resilience is the shaving of the head of a woman. When a woman shaves her head, either she's coming out of something or she's resisting something, she's fighting back. Keep that in mind. If you have someone who is typically someone who wears bouncy curls, very traditional look, and all of a sudden they shave their head, that's a warning sign. If you have someone who don't have access or possession of their important legal documents, that's a red flag. Someone who spends excessive hours working that doesn't seem to add up, that's a red flag. Someone who seems to be a little bit over actualized, put the S in there, that's a red flag. If they have multiple phones and multiple social media accounts, for example, if they work at massage businesses, and especially if they work in a massage business and they do seem to be working very long hours, that's also a red flag. I mentioned this in a prior video about a slightly different topic, but if you are noticing cuts on someone, that's also a red flag. If they're suddenly tatted up and they're more of a beauty person, stereotypical beauty person, that's also a potential signal. Another word that's our term that's being thrown around loosely is trauma bonding. And I would definitely say head over to some of my colleagues' platforms where they talk about this topic in a lot more detail and with much greater understanding than I can. But some of the signals of trauma bonding that can happen is if a relationship seems to have really high highs and really low lows, or a relationship that seems to be with an intense chemical attraction, a relationship that seems to be devoid of real substantive conversations, like individuals aren't really talking about their future or having conversation that is of substance, of depth, like what are your beliefs about this? What are your thoughts about the current economic state? Like conversations that people who are building lives together truly have, then that's also a red flag that the relationship may be a trauma bonding relationship, especially if relationship just seems to be primarily on a physical and on an actual level, put the S in there, then you may be involved in a relationship that is one of trauma bonding. If there seems to be no perspective about a future, about building together, and it all seems to be very intense and to the point where the individual even seem like they are addicted to each other, or one is addicted to the other, or it's mutual, then that may be a sign that they're in a trauma bonding relationship. And as mentioned already, sometimes it's really hard for people to get out of those circumstances because there is, as I mentioned, a bond. And they view that bond of being of some value to them and a value that they oftentimes have difficulty letting go. If you suspect that someone may be trafficked or you yourself think that you may be experiencing uh, human trafficking or attempt to be trafficked, then I want you to reach out to the hotline of 1-888-373-7888, or I want you to tap into RAINN, RAINN. And again, as a reminder, if you're someone in a precarious situation, make sure that you clear your browser. What are the costs of being a survivor? So this has come up, where people are like, folks only want a financial gain out of the situation. And my question is, why not? Like, people don't seem to really fully understand the cost of being a survivor. And so they feel that somehow you're supposed to just carry on with your life. And even though you've lost time, you lost productivity of work, possibly have lost your career, you have lost your ability to function, that somehow that doesn't have a price tag. Yet we know that there's a price tag to being a victim of IPV. We know that the lifetime economic cost associated with these services related to IPV is 3.6 trillion. There is a cost associated with this type of relationship or dynamics. So if a survivor desires to regain some of their loss in wages and the ability to be productive in life and function, then why not? Because the behavior of the predator or the abuser actually does cost not only the individual, but society as a whole. And so it's always perplexing to me when people are taken aback by the fact that that a survivor would even try to regain some of their losses in wages, in cost of pain and suffering. The 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 bones that were broken, the tissue that was swollen, the emotions that have been wrecked, the inability to have future relationships that are healthy, the trials that happen to even be productive in life, the flashback, the PTSD. There's a cost to being a victim, a very tangible cost. So why wouldn't they want to, or why shouldn't they deserve to regain some of that? Sometimes y'all treat women like, let me tell y'all treat women like crap. And this is why women oftentimes have to ask the question, and I'm not saying that men treat women like crap. I'm saying society as a whole treat women like, because you have women that ask the same questions. But this is why I'm here to answer those questions for y'all. Um, so yeah, and what's important to know is that the cost related to IPV, the cost to the individual, the tangible financial cost to an individual does increase based on their lifestyle. So if they have a higher priced lifestyle, then that cost is higher, right? The potential cost or loss of wages is higher than someone who lives a middle or lower income level. Financially speaking, I'm not talking about emotionally or physically. There's no price tag for those. But the cost of lost in wages and productivity is very real. And part of that it also includes the loss of reputation, right? Because if you are someone who works in a boardroom and something becomes public, then oftentimes it's really hard to overcome that reputation that even though it is not your fault, and that's important for all victims to know, it is not your fault, nor your responsibility to heal your abuser. But there's a cost to being in a boardroom with individuals, especially if you're an E-suite individual, with people who know your intimate details. That's real. That's very real. Okay, y'all. Before we go, we're gonna talk about the Black factor. Yeah, we're gonna talk about the Black factor because it's a situation. It's real. So, to my brothers, and a specific group of brothers, because not all brothers feel this way. To my brothers who've said that they feel like Black men are being victimized, who feel somehow that all of these situations is a victimization of Black brothers. One, I will say to you, it has been proven by multiple studies in multiple entities that the chances of falsification of these types of incidences are rare, or we should say uncommon, because people's definition of rare varies. They're uncommon. And so when you see individuals preemptively believe women, it's because most likely that individual is telling the truth. be not just more, almost definitely, not most likely, almost definitely that individual is telling the truth because it takes so much for them to even come forth to begin with. And so when a woman comes forth or a survivor of any background comes forth, believe that they have gone through a lot to even get to that point. And what's really disheartening is for people to question evidence, even when the court system has taken the side of a Black woman and said she has enough evidence to prove that she deserves a restraining order or she deserves to move forward with a trial, or a prosecutor picks up the case and indicts her abuser. There's still a hesitation that exists, that is historic, that denies Black women, especially, the benefit of the doubt. And what's even disheartening is that the same individuals who claim that there's somehow a targeting of Black men are the same individuals who will deny that the same type of predators that exist for Black women in the community are also victimizing Black men. But we don't seem to be ready to have those conversations. So until we're ready to accept that Black women are being victimized, we will never get to the point where we can help the brothers who are being victimized and understand that the system and the experience of a Black woman, the oppression that Black women experience, is double fold. The type of oppression that Black men experience is single fold. That's just what it is. Because unless you walk in our shoes as women, you won't fully understand what it's like to be in a Black woman in America. Because what people don't seem to understand is that a lot of times, if we don't stop the true predators in our communities, then they will continue to victimize other individuals because they have been enabled to continue with their pattern. And so it is in the community's benefit to identify who the predators are and that they get their just due so that the health of the community survives and so that there are not other victims in the community. There's a cost to not believing and a cost for a check that you can't write. So while your emotions are valid, we cannot base a full conversation solely on emotions. We must also, at some point, be able to include the facts. All right. That is all I have for y'all today, and I hope I have brought clarity. I jumped on here at the last minute. Like I said, I am Dr. T, and I am a women's health care provider, have been so for decades now. I have also been a former rape crisis counselor, say that 10 times fast. And I've also taught on this subject as well to future clinicians. So I hope I have brought some clarity to help with your ability to not sway you in any particular direction, because I don't have all the facts either about any particular case. I'm just identifying things that I've seen that are classically done and said with a number of cases that are signals that we haven't yet progressed in our understanding of the dynamics of these types of experiences. So my role today was just to bring to you some perspective so that you can listen with a contextual ear and make better sense of as to what you're hearing and be able to answer some of the very common questions that are often asked, but are also indications of a lack of understanding. Okay. All right. I'm the hand behind the handle of Healthy Bump Club right here on YouTube and Healthy Bump Club on Instagram. We thank you guys for watching and listening, and we hope to see you guys. I'm going to plug my other video that I broke down some of the information in a little bit more statistical way, instead of a conversational way. So if you want to get the raw stats, I'm going to hit up that video somewhere probably above here, so that you'll be able to get that information. So I hope you hit up that video, and Let me see, is there another video that y'all should tap into? If there is, I'm gonna put it in the description. I think there is another one. I just got to think about which one it was. But I hope that we've brought some clarity. That is the goal of our platform here at HBC. We thank you for joining the club. If you are new, don't forget to click the subscribe and the like. Give us a thumbs up if we've provided some information that was helpful to you. And even if you disagree, and if you do disagree, we ask that you hit us up with a comment. We thank you guys for watching. We hope to see you guys when the next episode. This is Dr. T, just a friendly reminder. Don't forget to comment, like, and share. And go ahead, why not? Click that subscribe button. Help us to get to the next 1,000 subscribers. We thank you guys for supporting.